All right, we are back with another episode of Sippin' Saints.
Nice.
Abel, we got Josiah, Zach, Amani, and we are here to talk a little bit about discerning God's will, or in other words, discerning or understanding or finding out God's desire for your life, for our life. Right?
It's good.
Yeah.
Zach, what do you think are some of the misconceptions that people have when they hear this word, the will of God, or God's will for their life?
Whenever I find myself in conversations when people are trying to discover the will of God for their lives, typically people are looking like for very specific, super clear, undeniable,
burning bush
signs of what God has planned for you in your future. This happens a lot. I wrestled with it a lot first when I was in high school, figuring out what college am I going to. I have to make this decision that will impact the rest of my life, what my career is going to be. And then also like it's often in these transition moments that this concern comes up for me. But I think the misconception is that the will of God, we were just talking about when we say the will of God, there's this like mystical, like, ooh, the will of God that kind of we think about. And we want it to be so clear and so specific with like detailed instructions about what decisions we're supposed to make in our lives for the rest of our lives. Yeah. And I think that is in an interesting way, almost like a limitation of what God's will actually is.
Wanting to know more about it in the future is actually a limitation to your current decision making.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I and if we want, we can start to get into what we think that is, what the will of God is or desire of God is, and how to discern that. But I think the will of God for us, you said, Abel, in the intro, in other words, what is the desire of God for us? That actually is a lot more broad. It's still specific. We get that in his word. But it actually frees us up to make decisions rather than being frozen and paralyzed in our decision making because we just don't know if this is the will of God or how to discern that. So I think we get stuck in that way, and I think that's one
Let's
of the
build on that. Yeah, that frozen idea, getting paralyzed.
Yeah, frozen either before you make a decision, but I think another misconception is once God has revealed like a part of his plan or like puts you in a place where you are, you forever thinking that this is it, this is what God has for me for the rest of my life. And sometimes that's not it. Sometimes it's just a period, and like you need to accept that maybe God is calling you out of that period or that phase.
Yeah. Even calling you out of a good thing.
Yeah.
But because there's another good thing that,
another good thing that you're not aware of, but that he knows.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, that's really good. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, let me read a few verses. I do agree with Zach. Like, I do think that the will of God is something that a lot of times sometimes people take the stand that no one can know, will never know. And I do think there's components of the desire and the will of God that are a mystery, or that some that we may not even know on this side of eternity. Sure. But then I think the Bible is pretty clear with us that we actually can know and discern and test the will of God. Very famous Romans 12 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So there's this process of, we have the old thinking of the world, old pattern, then we need to, take that thinking off. By the way, Romans 12, that doesn't happen just naturally either. I think that's the thing that we don't understand is I said this before, is, when we become a Christian, our status is updated, but our thinking is outdated. And so he talks about, you're this new creation, Romans chapter 12, verse 1, like, you're new, you're different, like God's, because of his great mercies, because like you're this new creature, right? But then he says, do not conform. So there's this, hey, you're new, you're different, you're changed, but your thinking is still outdated.
Yeah.
And so we actually have work to do to make sure that we take off these old ways of thinking to then add on the new ways. Yep. And as you embrace these new ways of thinking through scripture, through living in community with other believers, as we have this renewing of our mind, this changing of like, I see things different. I think about things different. I think about valuing things and valuing people different. Then we're actually able to not only, there would be a dual meaning here in this verse, that not only are we able to live out the will, but we're able to know the will or desire of God. This is, as I have this new thinking, as I know God's heart, I know his desire, and I'm able to live in his desire, right?
You need like a software update in your brain.
100%.
You know, a little update. And because it's true, like that, going back to that passage, that Romans 12 passage, and then like I want you to touch on the First Thessalonians passage you shared with us. Like you cannot, like, you become a new creation, but again, you're spot on. Paul says, do not be conformed to the world, because he knows that it's really easy to be conformed to the world. Meaning it's really easy to continue in the same lifestyle that you were living before following Jesus. And that can start to overlap, can start to overflow into your new now lifestyle, your new mindset, your new status as a
way
human
of thinking,
being, way of thinking, right? And so you're spot on. You have to intentionally press in to growth. You don't go to the gym and just because you walk through the front door, you're growing muscles. You actually have to grab a weight.
I wish it was that way.
I wish it was that way too, man. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? But
My
you have
gym
to
membership would actually be used.
Yeah. I'm in. I'm good now. Let's go. You have to actually pick up the weight and start lifting, start pulling, start pushing, right? You have to start doing the work in order. And when you leave that first day of the gym, you don't see anything, but your muscles feel it, right? Mm-hmm. And you might be in a point right now where you don't see the growth that's happening in your walk with the Lord, but continue to press in, right? Because as your mind renews, like Paul says, you will start to test and improve what the will of God is for your life. And sometimes the will is like this mystical thing, but you know what we see in First Thessalonians, it really isn't all that mystical.
Yeah. In First Thessalonians, which may be a book that not all of us spend much time in, but it's actually
I actually just started it yesterday.
Hey,
yeah,
nice.
Funny enough, yeah.
Wow, what a coincidence.
Yeah, I know.
So Paul is writing this letter to this group of believers who follow Jesus in a place called Thessalonica. That's what the letter is. And in it, he's just talking with them. He's talking about how much he loves them, how much he like cares for them, all these things. But at one point, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 3, he says, God's will is for you to be holy. And then he goes on, so stay away from all sexual sin, then each of you will. And then he starts talking about what it looks like to live practically as holy. And it means a certain way of behavior, of living in light of God's desire and God's goodness and this newness that Josiah was talking about. But it's super simple.
Yeah.
God's will for you is to be holy. And
if you're ever asking the question, what's God's will for my life? Boom.
We've got the answer here, straight to you. Extra, read all about it.
Breaking news.
Breaking news, yeah.
God's will is for you to be holy. But the thing is, holiness can look different when it's lived out in each of our lives.
Define holiness.
Holiness. Oh, I was just reading about holiness yesterday. Holiness is, generally thought of like being set apart from, just common use, so like you got a trash can and then you've got a holy trash can. A trash can is not
a recycle bin, right?
A trash can is for any kind of trash. A holy trash can, that's set apart for special use.
Yeah.
Just as a silly example, but what we see is the most holy, the thing that holy is described as most is God. God is the one who's holy. He is the one who is completely set apart.
Yeah.
And in that set apartness, being set apart, he is good, he is perfect, he is true, all these things. And he comes close to make us holy, to set us apart, to set us apart from common use, the common trash can, to make us a holy trash can. Which, man, some days I just feel like a holy trash
some
can.
Days, man, some
New
weeks.
podcast name.
Holy
set
trash
apart
can.
though. The point is set apart for some kind of special purpose and function. And, and even that can make you start to think of, what's my special purpose or function?
Yeah.
The thing is, like, that's not always one specific thing always. The idea is you seek to honor the Lord with your life in whatever the Lord has you in right now. So if he has you working as a janitor at a school, be holy in the way you clean up the school. If he has you working in an office, be holy, be set apart, live differently than the people around you. Live by honoring the Lord and the newness that he's brought about in you by doing your work well.
Yeah.
So holiness, the will of God looks different for each one of us, but it's rooted in that God desires to make you new. God desires to set you apart. Yeah. God desires to bring about this new creation in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's that, at least for me, like, I think, as you're following Jesus and you're really taking your relationship with him seriously, like, the conviction when you're not living a life, or when you fall, or when you sin, like, I think that's why the conviction is so heavy. One, because that that's not what honors God, but two, your soul, your mind, as it's being renewed, knows that there's a different way of life, and there's a different way of living than what you were just caught up in. And that's because God has put that desire in you to live a life that's holy, right? To live a life that's set apart, to live a life that's honoring him. It doesn't mean you're always going to be perfect, right? But you're striving for this life where that's like, in every facet of my life, I'm going to do my best to try to honor the Lord and make sure that I'm living a life that's set apart, that's holy, that's being used by him, because that's what he's called and asked me to do, right?
Mm-hmm. So what do we do? What do we say to someone maybe who's listening, who is maybe at a transition in their life, or trying to figure out, is this the job I should stay in? Or maybe they're about to graduate college, and they're thinking, what's next in my life? Mm-hmm. And they're saying, sipping saints, how do I figure out the will of God for my life? Yeah. What would you say to them if they came to you with that question?
I think first off, I personally, sometimes you take that question of like, what is God's will for my life as a burden, and it's constantly like weighing over you. What is God's will for my life? And it gets too heavy sometimes. But what if we changed our mindset? My dad would always say, hay que cambiar el chip. Like, you need to change your mindset of instead of looking at it as like a burden, something that's weighing you down, but like dream and like be content, because like God has a beautiful like will for, like, his desires for you are good. Like, he's never gonna desire something bad for you, so like, change that mentality. Like, first off, start praying about it. Like, God, your plans are going to be so great for me. Like, what are they? Reveal to me in time. So like, I personally have started like viewing it differently, of instead of like it being a burden of like, what am I going to do after college? Like, God, where do you want me? Because is it here? Is it across the world? And like, I've started asking it, or like saying it in a more positive way. I tend to be an optimist sometimes.
That's
and
good.
Try to see things like in a positive light of like, oh, like, it's going to be good, whatever it's going to be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good.
When my dad was, he was asked to apply to Moody, and then he was asked to apply again. And so he entered into this process, not really knowing if he should be the president or if that's what God wanted. He felt like, so he started fasting a few months into the process, and he felt like the Lord gave him clarity and said this to him. He said, felt like the Lord said, you'll have clarity in the process. You have clarity in the process. Yeah. And I think that's sometimes how it is when God's, we're entering into a new season, or there's something put in front of us, an opportunity, a place that we could go and do ministry, a relationship. Sometimes you're not going to know until you enter into that, and you will have more clarity as you enter in, and you'll find out like, this is not right, or this is not the right relationship, or this is where I'm supposed to be, and this is feeling like this is. So I think sometimes it's a little bit of a discerning process to be able to figure out the will of God, and sometimes you're not going to know until you take a few steps.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah, that reminds me of a phrase I just had to look it up because I don't know what it originally came from. It comes from a poem by a Spanish poet, Antonio Machado.
It's a good name.
Yeah. But the phrase is, we make the road by walking.
It's good.
And I haven't read the whole poem, so I can't like fully endorse it. So it just like, you know,
just takes a
but
wild
that
turn
line,
from there.
that line has stuck out to me because I just feel like that's so true of life, and I feel like that's accurate to discerning the will of God for us.
Yes.
It's discovered in the process. There is no road. Sometimes we make the road by walking and discovering as we go. Oh, this is good. This is a good thing.
Yeah.
And so I feel like when we're faced with multiple decisions, especially when there are multiple that are difficult, and they maybe multiple options seem really good, sometimes you just pursue them. You just pursue one or you just go and you start walking, and then, you know, if the Lord really doesn't want you to go that way, you know, he'll bring in something to guide you in a different way. He'll, you know, maybe you won't feel at ease, maybe some doors will close, and then you say, okay, it wasn't that one, let's go to this one. And I think there's a lot of freedom in trusting that goodness, that what God has is good, and he will not abandon you to this like road that leads to nowhere. He will find a way to guide you into something good if you find yourself in something that might not be so good. For me, in my own life, that really came for me back when I was figuring out college, figuring out what I was going to do with my life. That came to me through conversations with my community. Because I was torn in so many different directions about like, where do I go? What do I do with my life? And some part of it wanted to kind of go into ministry. Some wanted to be like a teacher. Some wanted to be all kinds of crazy things, to be honest. But I was pulled in all these directions and just like anguished over the decision. And I remember having a conversation with a leader who he actually used to be a youth leader at my church, but was now at another church. But I had a conversation with him and just like was sharing my struggle. And he's like, Zach, I don't know what God's plan for you is, what God is leading you into, but I can tell you this. Because of what you've shared with me, I can tell you that you have a heart for ministry and that God can use that. I don't know what that looks like for you. I can't tell you with any clarity. You know, isn't this like huge prophetic moment? It's like, you know, in 10 years, you're going to be doing this. But it was a prophetic moment in that he, with the wisdom he had, the experience he had, the relationship with God that he was able through the Spirit to recognize this kind of heart and desire in me. And he said, I think you should at least be open to it. And he didn't say it with any certainty, but just like, I can tell this, be open. And then the next week, I was at a camp, youth camp, and the preacher was speaking on surrendering to the will of God for our lives, whatever that looks like. Basically, the question was, if God called you into uncomfortable places, would you be willing to go? And that was speaking on one of my hesitations for pursuing ministry, because I had constantly been told, you're not going to make any money in ministry. You're going to struggle. You're going to do all these things. And I come from a family where money was kind of an issue. So I was hesitant, but the preacher was speaking, and I just, you know, felt that like stirring within me. That was like, hey, he's talking to you. And so, but because of the conversation I had the previous week with that leader, I was prepared to be open to the potential. Hey, maybe God is calling you in this direction. But that wasn't like that still wasn't clear, like, hey, Zach, you're going to do this and this and this. The road was made by me taking the steps, encouraged by my community. That's the point I'm making. My community being open, pursuing certain passions in my community, sharing my struggles, allowed my community to speak into my life and help me to make a decision to take those like faltering steps in one direction that I was hesitating to go into. Discovering that it was a beautiful and pleasing thing. But sometimes, I mean, that could look like multiple good things in your life, you know?
Yeah, sometimes you're forced to take a decision because of you're reaching the end of the road, like high school, graduating high school. Then you're forced with the decision of like, what am I going to study? And sometimes it's after college of like, where am I going to work? But we forget that there's a whole period in between, like those 4 years. And I remember freshman and sophomore year of my prayer was always, Lord, what is your will? What is your plan? What's your desire for after I graduate? Moody. And I realize now, senior year, that I wasted a lot of time praying about like 4 years down the road when I could have been praying like, what is your will for me this week?
It's good.
Yeah.
What is your your will for me while I'm here? What should I be doing right now? Because sometimes we think about the will of God as something that's so far away, but sometimes it's, what's your will for tomorrow?
Yeah.
Like, should I wake up and what should I do? You know?
Yeah.
Or should I sleep in?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your
Should
desire?
I skip my classes?
I think that's your desire. You know, one of the things, and this is a business thought, but one of the things that was helpful for me, so the former CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, he had this article and shared this concept that's been helpful in decision making, because that's part of what we're talking about. Like when you're at a fork in the road, we want to live out the desire that God has for us, but sometimes you need to take a few steps. Sometimes God will make it clear before, but sometimes you need to take a few steps to realize, oh, this isn't the right thing, or this is the right thing. And one of the things Bezos talks about, he says, most decisions fall into two categories. There's one-way decisions and there's two-way decisions. And the one-way decisions is you kind of walk through a door and you can never go back through that door. And he said those are very, very, very rare decisions, super rare. He says the other decisions are, two-way. You walk through the door, and if you realize it's not right or you made the wrong decision, you can walk back through that door. He said those are much more common. He said the problem is that most of the decisions we make are those two-way, but we treat them like they're one-way. We treat them like you can walk through it, and once you walk through it, like you're never going to be able to leave that. Like all the opportunities are off the table because you took that job, or you'll never be able to leave it. Or if you go to that country, you go to that place, but that's just not how it is. Yeah. Those are super rare decisions for that. And yet we treat almost every decision like it's a one-way decision. Like we do it, our life's forever going to be changed. It's going to be ruined, and we'll never be able to work back. And so I think kind of what you were saying even earlier, this idea of taking the burden off. I think sometimes we put too much burden even on the decision, right? Too much like, this is going to be a life-altering decision. I'll never be able to rebound from this. And it's just, for 99% of decisions, that's just not the case.
It's true. I think a prayer that I've liked to pray over the years is align my desires with your desire. So whatever your desire is, Lord, whatever your want is, just align my heart to that, so that I know that even as I'm making a decision where I don't have yet too much clarity on which way to go, I know that, okay, the decision that I'm going to make, because I've been praying this prayer, because I'm earnestly seeking that, I know that in faith, the Lord will, allow me to walk through that door. And if it's not the right one, you could always come back through it as well. Professor told me this when I was at Moody, is that a lot of times you're faced with like two good options. Like it's rarely one good option and one bad option. A lot of times it's multiple good options or two good options.
Which is harder.
Yeah, which is harder. But what he was saying is like, you just take the time, pray about it, think it through, think each one through, right? Don't make a mindless decision. But when you make the decision, walk in faith and know that God is with you if he's allowed that door to open. And if he, changes course, then he changes course, right? And you have to be flexible with that. But I think for me that was super, in a sense, like liberating. It kind of took the burden off of decision making, because I knew that I'm going to genuinely seek the Lord about this, and then I will make a decision based off of what I've prayed, the wisdom that I've sought from others, and I will step out in faith into that decision. So
yeah.
Sometimes his desire as well is not in these just huge categories, like these life-altering decisions. But sometimes his desire is just in the simple things, right? It's in the seemingly small things, right? 1 Thessalonians 5:18, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you, right? So it's not always these end of a season, career change, move somewhere different. Yeah. But what this is saying is God's desire for us is that in every circumstance in life, we would also give thanksgiving. Yep. So it's simple but profound things like that God is saying, hey, there's a lifestyle that I want you to live. There's a way, not just a path that I want you to walk, but a way that I want you to live as you're coming to these, life-altering big decisions, season changes, and simple things like just giving thanks in every season, in every circumstance is part of my desire for you as my child.
Yeah, I was just reminded of these two stories. I think we may have even talked about them on the podcast before, so I'll just share them quickly. But two stories in Scripture where I feel like maybe the men involved would have maybe struggled to see the point of what they were doing, or maybe had like kind of written off the hopes that they used to have or whatever. So, or the questions that they had. I think this speaks to us because I feel like a lot of times in life we just feel lost. Like maybe there aren't these big decisions. So you're talking about the small moments. Maybe we just get lost in those small moments and think like, is there any significance to what I'm even doing right now? Like, what does God have for me? Is this all God has for me? That, you know, those kind of thoughts. Or maybe we're like trying to follow God in the will, in his will. And we're like, I don't see anything yet, that kind of thing. So I think two stories speak to each of those. The first is Abram. And remember, God came to Abram and called him to leave all of his family, all of his home behind. And he says, "I will go to the land I will show you." So Abram takes all of his stuff, all of his family, all of his belongings, all of his possessions, and travels to a completely different place, leaving his family behind. And if you look on a map at where he's at when things happen, like if you follow the story with a map, Abram walks halfway through the land of Canaan, and he camps at a place called Shechem. And it is there at Shechem where God comes to Abram and says, hey, look to your north, south, east, west. All of this land is the place that I'm going to give to you and to your descendants. But Abram had been walking for miles and miles through the land before that was even revealed. He was he was like dead smack in the center, if you look on the map, of the land when God reveals it to him. Hey, this is the place. You've been walking in the promise this whole time. So sometimes we're like looking for God's will, and we're like smack dab in the middle of it. Kind of like what you were sharing earlier. No, why don't we ask, what God do you have for me this week? And then the second story is Moses. When, you know, he has this heart for delivering his people from slavery, but he goes about it the wrong way by killing an Egyptian. And he flees into the wilderness. He's there for 40 years in the wilderness. He marries a woman from from Midian, from another culture, and he's a shepherd just leading sheep around in the wilderness for 40 years. And I just think of that, and I'm like, man, he must have been bored sometimes. He must have been questioning his purpose and thinking like, wow, how far I have fallen. I used to be in Egypt and like in royalty, and now I'm here. But it's in the wilderness where God comes to him, meets him in a burning bush. He gets a pretty cool sign. But after 40 years, and God comes and appoints him and says, "You're going to deliver the people from slavery." And then Moses ends up being the one to guide this freshly freed people like sheep through the wilderness, and eventually for 40 years. And all of a sudden it becomes clear that 40 years where he may have been questioning, where we don't really even get much of the story, where he may have been lost in the small details of just like, hey, where are these sheep going to eat today? Where are they going to drink today? All that time was preparing him to shepherd the people of Israel and to do this very significant work that God had for him. But he may not have been able to see that in the mundane, in the week to week. You know, what does God have for me? Is this all he has for me? So I think that speaks to us in that sometimes we get lost in these details, get lost in the day to day, these small things, this feeling of insignificance. And I think there's two things. One, God may have you right in the middle of his will this whole time, and you just haven't realized it. And you just need to come to that openness and realization. And two, God is probably preparing you for something that he has for you in the future. And I think both of those things are true at the same time. God has you where he has you, and he will take you where he will take you. And he's good enough and has a good enough track record for us to trust that is true and to live in light of it.
I think the Thanksgiving, building on that, you know, the Thanksgiving in those waiting in between moments in our life helps us be patient. Because sometimes it is God's will, his desire for us to be in the field shepherding to prepare us for what's next. By the way, that's both Moses and David. Both of them shepherding, you know, taking care of sheep before they ever take care of a nation. And so sometimes that's what God is preparing us. There's a season, there's a moment where he's saying, I need to prepare you because you're not ready. There's a purpose here. And I think a lot of times we get, well, I'm not doing with that. I'm not doing with that person and that person, and there's a restlessness. And I think that's why it's important for us to realize that there's a season for everything. Not every season is for us to be in a position of great influence, not every life even but also that in that moment, one of the things that allows us to be more patient and to have joy even in that season of God working and preparing and building is Thanksgiving. Like, there are things that are still good, and it is more important, not just the destination, but the journey. And so God is taking you on a journey of your growth and development and maturity, and that is his will. It was the will of God for Moses to be in the desert for 40 years to prepare him for it. He could have brought that burning bush at any moment, but it was God's will to prepare him. Maybe there's some mentality, some things he had to break, some things he had to do, but it was God's will. And then it was God's will at that moment to say, I'm going to have a new mission or objective or season for Moses in front of him.
Yeah, definitely. Any last thoughts on God's will, God's desire for your life as we wrap up today's episode?
Amani, drop some gold on us.
No, I was just thinking that sometimes you think God's will is just like a big decision, but sometimes it's not a big decision. Sometimes it's, God, what is your will through this phase of suffering that I'm going through? Maybe this season, that's no life-altering decision, but it's just like sad, you know? So
can we say, since she talked about grief, can we, one of the things that when there's another time that I see God's will talked about is when unexpected things happen, and maybe that's a death, and people will say, I just don't understand why this happened. I don't understand why this person died. I don't know. And by the way, I'd say number one, practically, your job is not to give them a theological answer for suffering, right? But it's to be present and just love them and listen. But Spurgeon, so my dad was with this guy who's a long-term missionary now, and they lost their child after a few days of being born. My dad was new to being a pastor, and so they met at Dunkin' Donuts, and he met with him, and his name was Jeff, and he said, Jeff, like, I'm so sorry, like, you lost your child, like, my heart's broken with you. And Jeff quoted Spurgeon and said, this quote has been incredibly helpful for me as I'm navigating the season of loss. He said, Spurgeon said, when you can't understand God's hand, you know that you can trust his heart. And so it's okay. I think sometimes we need to remind people it's okay to not know why or the will or the plan, why that happened. It's okay not to know. And I think in those seasons when we are really struggling to know, why is this happening in my life, or why am I in this season, or why am I here longer than I think to, or why does it feel like I'm taking a step back, is just to say, I don't understand, the hand of God or why the situation's happening, but I know I can trust God's heart. I know I can trust his heart. And so I think it always, whether it's the lordship or it's the will, it comes back to, do you trust God's heart though? That he's taking you on a journey that will be different than everybody else, but it's going to be a unique and a special journey for you, his child, and he loves you in a perfect way as your father. So
it's a powerful reminder, a beautiful reminder to end this episode on. Hopefully it was beneficial to you and you were able to get some nuggets, some wisdom, and be able to be encouraged in this, just navigating God's desire for your life. We will see you next time on Sipping Saints.
Keep on sipping.
Keep on sipping.